This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft, because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, we're doing something different. In fact, something that has never been done in the history of the Storyworks Roundtable. I am recording in my living room with this very high-tech TV tray as a microphone stand. I'll try not to bump it again. And the special occasion is I'm joined by my good friend, Nicodemus Wolfgang Taranovsky.
That sounds awesome.
It does sound awesome. It's awesome. Nico and I go way back. We met on our first day of school.
Yep, that's right.
Yep. This was the first day of our MFA program, January of 2010.
So almost 10 years ago.
Almost 10 years ago.
I'm very old.
Yeah. Although it would be more impressive if we had met on our first day of kindergarten.
Yes, that would have been impressive.
Yes. So I trapped you into sitting down with me so that we can talk about writing fantasy. Nico is a fantasy author, a teacher with the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop, and my go-to critique partner when I need help with my own work. So thank you, Nico.
And vice versa.
Yes, and vice versa. So thank you.
Yeah,
Did I miss anything? Anything
No.
you want to add to that?
No, that is everything.
Excellent. So first, can you tell us a little bit about your journey as an author of fantasy? What got you started writing fantasy?
I think having really dorky parents helps a lot, because both my mother and father were reading fantasy when it was not a cool thing to do. And so they started me very young on things like reading Poe, and then also reading Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and those kinds of stories. And we had shelves and shelves of books, all fantasy related. And I don't think that's true of most parents in the 70s.
Right.
So
that is a good plug for nerd parents right there.
Nerd parents are good.
Nerd parents raise cool kids.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so, okay, Poe, I don't really think of him as fantasy. I think of him more as horror or gothic genre. And as you know, I just taught a speculative fiction course. So can you address kind of pure fantasy versus fantasy as an umbrella, or fantasy as part of speculative fiction, and give us a little groundwork there?
Yeah, I think of fantasy that has any elements in it that are purely outside the realm of the possible. And so usually what happens is when you talk about fantasy, you talk about it in comparison to literary fiction, but more often in comparison to science fiction. And so science fiction is also sort of any number of possibilities, but it is, it's all things that conceptually could be possible. So even if you've got cyborgs or robots that are running around that look completely human, it's still in the realm of the possible in the future at some point. Fantasy is something where, unless we really shifted or found something out about ourselves that we just didn't know about, would not be possible. So these are things like dragons or magic or stuff like that. And any kind of the supernatural, like hauntings or curses or anything like that, I think falls under that sort of rubric of fantasy. Within fantasy, there are 1,001 little subgenres that have popped up. Everything from the 1930s, when people were writing like in weird tales, all the way up through like the pulp fiction of the 50s and 60s, and then into sort of a more of a renaissance of fantasy in the late 80s, 90s, and certainly since Harry Potter was published and even adults got turned on to fantasy again. And then you have a whole wave of a generation that grew up on Harry Potter, where fantasy has become sort of a primary thing. It's no longer sort of, in the back of the bookstore somewhere. It's one of the celebrated genres. And so there are an almost infinite number of subgenres underneath there. And certainly with Game of Thrones, it's become even more so after that.
Definitely. Now, the Weird Tales era seemed to me like fantasy, or those stories that were being printed in those magazines, they were very hybrid. Part sci-fi, part fantasy, part realism, part, I
think it depends. I just finished rereading The Maker of Gargoyles, which I think is okay. I think the author's name, I'm terrible with author names, but I think it starts with Ashton, and I don't remember what the last name is. The Maker of Gargoyles is pure fantasy. It's in a make-believe part of France or province of France. There's cathedrals, there's clerics, there's priests, but there are fantastic things that happen in this sort of made-up part of France.
Was that published in Weird Tales?
I believe it was.
Okay.
I believe it was.
Okay.
And Weird Tales and other things like that during the 30s and the sort of pulp fiction of the 40s and 50s had a wide variety of everything from UFOs to dragons to...
Conan the Barbarian got his origin there in Weird Tales.
One of the more unfortunate elements. It was responsible for a large part of the popularity of fantasy in the sort of early days.
So I know you've done a lot of reading and have surveyed a lot of different types of fantasy. So could you give us kind of a overview of how fantasy has changed, where you think it originated, and where we're at today, and just kind of hit any bullet points you want to in between?
Sure. I think if you were to look it's an interesting question. As a unique or clearly defined genre, I think it's going to be hard to find its starting point, because you can go back to sort of stories that were told around the campfire, to myths and legends, to that then proliferate all across the world. And so whether these things are considered sort of part of a cultural identity and part of a cultural genre, or whether these things then can be looked at as sort of more the origins of where we get modern fantasy, I would say it's hard to differentiate them. Most people look at the late 19th century as the start of what our current fantasy genre is. There were some sort of real classics that were, I think one of them is like The Well at the End of the World. There's the story of Lilith, which was another sort of real foundational tale. And from there, fantasy sort of starts to pick up more and more. In the 30s and 40s, it starts to merge into pulp fiction more often. It becomes sort of seedy. It has sort of real racist overtones at times, with like Conan the Barbarian and things like that.
Yeah, all things H.P. Lovecraft.
H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, H.P. Lovecraft had some very interesting ideas, but you could really sense the xenophobia. That's part of his sort of, his worldview is filled with these sort of strange others. And so, and then into 60s, 70s, when you have more diverse audiences coming in and writers coming in, like Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, folks like that, who wrote really just dramatically different things, but it was still within that same genre. To now, there is a absolute proliferation, and you have everyone from Neil Gaiman to Joe Abercrombie to N.K. Jemisin, so it's like all over the place, and the stories are as diverse as the world of people who are reading them and writing them.
Okay, so if somebody wants to write fantasy today and really be marketed as fantasy,
Yeah.
and not as, slipstream or gothic or horror or any of these other, they don't want to be a subcategory or a hybrid. What would you say defines fantasy today, or what would that writer have to kind of keep in mind as they develop their story?
I have no idea. I think that I think it's such a wide spectrum of things that you can write about, that in writing sort of modern fantasy, you could touch on sort of virtually anything. I think that what you wouldn't want to do is disrupt the reader's expectations of fantasy. Mm-hmm. So if you started off writing a story that presented itself as fantasy and then had no elements of the supernatural or no elements of the sort of impossible in it, mm-hmm. I think that might upset a reader. But I can even see value in that from a fantasy perspective. I can see value in that as a reader of fantasy and as a writer of fantasy, that mm-hmm. that might spark some interest and some interesting discussion. But if you're looking to write really classic fantasy, then I would say, there's got to be some magic in it.
Right.
There's got to be some world building, some world as character. Mm-hmm. There's got to be some creatures in it. I would no longer say that there needs to be a good or an evil. In fact, I think if you were to try to write a very clearly defined good and evil, you would get pushback on it. The idea of these sort of very clear tropes of good and evil is it's no longer something that I think appeals to a mass audience.
Right. That's interesting. So that's one change.
Yeah,
that we've seen with modern or maybe even postmodern fantasy versus the classical.
The most fun thing for me was to see this discussion within short stories of the whole black and white notion of Tolkien's world of Middle Earth, mm-hmm. where all of a sudden there's this discussion of racism towards orcs and what that orcs were just sort of trying to get by, and that there's this whole breakdown of this sort of very dichotomous world that Tolkien created, and lots more shades of gray, which mm-hmm. I think is much more interesting to readers because it's much more realistic. We all come to life with our own perspectives. And so seeing those multiple perspectives, even though some of them may seem wrong to us mm-hmm. or may hold some of the sort of normal trappings of evil, I think if you create characters who have no motivation, no background, who are sort of two-dimensional, you're going to get pushback nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely. So world building, magic, creatures, no black and white, good versus evil. Yep. Anything you would add to that?
No, it's pretty open. I mean, mm-hmm. it really can do just about anything you want.
Yeah. Now, isn't it true that in order to be fantasy, you must depart from our known world of human experience? So when you say magic and world building and creatures, that's really what it's about, is taking your reader into a time, a place, a realm that is different from our own, distinct from it.
Yes and no. I mean, if you look at something like a lot of what Neil Gaiman does is mm-hmm. he does not take us outside of our current world. He sort of brings that stuff into our world. And so, like American Gods, he will take something like the basic settings in the Midwest, mm-hmm. Like the House on the Rock in Wisconsin. Right. And he will then imbue it with something that's more than what may be there originally.
Right.
But he's still using our setting.
Right. But in our world, we don't expect
No.
these gods to
No, we don't.
descend in battle and, hitchhike cross country and so on and so forth.
But I think that there's a certain power in that, because what Tolkien did was to create this sort of very separate world in which these things existed sort of very clearly. And what Gaiman does a lot of the time is to say, look, right around the corner from us are these things. I mean, you can see this in London Underground. You can see this in the Graveyard Book. You can see this in Coraline. All these sort of experiences where just around the corner there's something magical, there's something strange and different.
Right.
And I think that's why Gaiman has such a following now, because of the fact that there is this feeling that there's sort of this magical essence to life that could be just around the corner, and you can sort of sense it when you go to the right setting. I mean, it will be different for everyone, but maybe in a cathedral or the quietness of the forest. I mean, you can sort of sense what created the need in our ancestors to tell stories about like forest spirits and, what was hiding up in the rafters of the cathedral, or what the spirits of a particular lake or river might be. And so that sense that there's something sort of right around the corner or hiding in the darkness.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you were saying that, it got me thinking that in a way, what Gaiman's writing does is it brings us full circle back in touch with our original oral traditions, when
For sure.
you are looking for the spirit in the lake
Yeah.
or the demon in the cathedral, all of those.
Or what's hiding in the dark.
Yeah. Interesting. All right. So you turned me on to a literary theory book about fantasy by Farah Mendlesohn.
Yes.
And I want us to talk about that a little bit, because we're already kind of touching on the topic here. You mentioned how Neil Gaiman brings the magic into our world. And then there are fantasies like Tolkien where we have to enter another realm entirely. So, as you know, Farah Mendlesohn gives us 4 categories of fantasy for ways in which the reader and the reader through the characters interact with the magic. So, portal quest, immersion, intrusion, and liminal. Do you want to define portal quest for us?
Portal quest is what I think of as the...
And that's portal/quest.
Yeah.
Portal and/or quest.
I used to think it was like one thing. So like there was a quest for a portal or something like that.
Right.
Portal quest is what I think of when I think of Tolkien, or when I think of C.S. Lewis. I mean, C.S. Lewis is literal. So in Portal Quest, there is this transition period where you start out in a normal world. And whether that's a normal world that we're not familiar with, like the Shire, but the protagonist is familiar with that world. Or whether that is a normal world like sort of Victorian England, or I think
Kansas.
That's World War One, I think is C.S. Lewis. And so maybe that's that is, Edwardian England.
Right.
And so you start out in this normal place, and then there is a transition. And in the case of the portal, like the wardrobe in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you're actually going through a door from one world into another, and then the story, the adventure begins in that other world. In the quest, it's the same basic structure, but instead of going through a literal door, you're going through a sort of a metaphoric door with the protagonist when they take on the responsibility of the quest. And so both of them had that sort of very classic fantasy feel. I often think of it that there's this sort of slang of the farm boy story, like farm boy into like warrior king or great wizard or something like that, where this sort of unknown character goes and becomes this sort of great wizard, and they were always supposed to be the one, but they had to go through the portal on the quest.
Yeah, it's like Luke Skywalker.
Right, exactly.
Classic
Portal
example
quest
of that.
fantasy. So that's probably the best definition that I can give. And usually, by the way, it comes full circle where at the end of the story, they've gone through the quest, they've gone through the portal, and then they come back at the end of the story, and there's a sort of a closure at the end of that.
Right. And The Wizard of Oz is a really great example of this. You can read it or even watch the old Judy Garland film. So some traits of the portal quest, the world, the journey through the world once you pass through that door or accept the responsibility of the quest is part of that category of fantasy that readers love and expect. So writers spend more time world building, more time with descriptions, making the world itself fantastical, whether it's, the talking scarecrow, the flying monkeys, the trees that throw apples at you. The orcs. The orcs, all of these elements are key features in the Portal quest story. Is there anything else you would add as...
Well, I think that those are the biggest elements. It's when you go out of that sort of, when you go out of the known, when you go out of the known world or the world the protagonist knows, the world has to shift a lot. And so that's where you get the creatures that are new. That's where you get the magic that's new. So if you look at the Shire, they're hobbits, but they don't really have magic, and they are very much like Edwardian farmers in many ways.
Right. Yes. They have their tea cozies and their walking sticks.
Which that's probably why they appealed to me so much when I was younger. But that is the. Then there's got to be that dramatic shift, and I think that's the primary thing. Yeah,
and also when we do take that shift and go through the portal, our protagonist, our point of view character, is entering a new world, or in the case of Tolkien, it's the same larger world, but it's a very new world for our character,
for the protagonist,
going abroad, basically. And so we as readers learn about the world through the protagonist. So the protagonist gets to wonder and ask questions, and things can be explained to the protagonist in order to explain them to the reader, which is a key difference from the immersion fantasy.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like, in hearing you say that, I think to myself, well, if the Lord of the Rings was written from Aragorn's point of view, if Aragorn was the protagonist, it would be a completely different story, and it would be an immersion story, because Aragorn already knows what's going on. He's not going to stop and describe anything to anyone. He's part of the process already, and so he's in the story from the get-go. There isn't any sort of learning about the One Ring or about what the other 9 rings are, or what he doesn't need to know any of that stuff. He already knows it. And that's what an immersion story does. It sort of puts you into the story already. You don't get a lot of introduction to things. One good example of this is, and I'm going to mess up the author's name because I always do. I think his last name is Erickson. It's called Gardens of the Moon. And it's, you just drop right into the story. And there's all this stuff about the Empress, the tunnels that you can travel through that are sort of, beyond regular space and time, the way that magic works, all of these things that you just have to accept are happening, and you don't get any framework for it. So immersion usually is for, I wouldn't say the hardcore fantasy fan, but I don't think that most people who would just pick up a book without already being fantasy fans would pick up an immersion book, because they would get too lost. You sort of almost have to be clued in already to the structure and framework, to the knowledge that you're going to be presented with a new world, to being okay with that before you are ready for an immersion fantasy. But the real effectiveness of that is that it's sort of like if you're traveling to a completely different culture, if you're, say, traveling from Japan and you're coming to America, if you have never spent time in America before, it is an immersion experience. Everyone's speaking a different language, the customs are different, the culture is different, and really different depending on what part of America you're going to. the food is different, everything is different, and everything you're going to have to experience right then and there without anyone explaining things to you. You don't get a tour guide necessarily for it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great way to put it too, is in the Portal Quest story, you get a tour guide through your point of view character. And in the immersion story, you have to understand things from context, from how it's used. You have to
precisely
infer. And so then as a writer, if you're writing the immersion fantasy, you have to be aware of what your reader knows and understands, and what, and build in that learning process for your readers so that they don't get frustrated. And
which is a really which is then places the emphasis on the details that you're giving to the reader. It places the emphasis. You're more reliant on the protagonist that you choose, because if the protagonist that you're choosing doesn't notice any of the things that will give the readers clues to understand what's going on in the story, then the immersion fantasy could fail. And so you have to be really strict. With the Portal Quest, it's very easy. Your protagonist doesn't know anything. With your immersion point of view character, you need to be more sophisticated with the choice of protagonist, in that they have to both already be a part of the culture, but still have enough of a rich point of view to be able to take things in and give them back to the reader in such a way that they'll follow what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. If Harry had been a full wizard raised by wizards instead of raised by muggles, and then, we open Harry Potter, and he knows everything that's going on. He's never lost. He's never confused. He never has to ask questions. He knows what it means when people say "he who can't be named."
Then you'd be writing the story of Ron Weasley, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know it would be that popular.
Probably not. Poor Ron.
Yeah, poor Ron.
Poor Ron. But there are some ways to get around this, like looking at your protagonist's career. So think of something that we can relate to. And, your protagonist might be a teacher or a doctor where there's an assistant. And so your protagonist has to explain things to the assistant. Think of Doctor Who's assistant. Every time they go off Earth, that assistant has to say, "Why, doctor?
Yeah.
What is this? What does this mean?" How else can writers craft the immersion fantasy so that they don't lose their reader?
I think that there has to be some bearing for the reader. In N.K. Jemison's Hugo Award-winning trilogy, and I blank on the names of these things. I think one of them is The Stone Gate. I can't remember the names of the other ones. I've read them, but the names always just escape me altogether.
Catherine will look these things up and put them in the show notes, everybody.
That's great.
So.
In one of the primary characters there is a woman who is coming out of an abusive relationship, and who escapes an abusive relationship. So that's one of the protagonists, and you can instantly relate to that. I mean, that's something which is accessible. There's another sort of cast of characters who have what I can only call geologic capabilities, in that they have the ability to shape stone and control earthquakes and things like that, which in this world, which I sort of get the sense is a sort of a late Earth. It's been a while since I've read it, but like an Earth that's been devastated in some way, geologically over and over again. That there's this cast of individuals who is viewed as sort of like the sort of anti-Semitism in, well, unfortunately more and more now you see all over the U.S., but was very prevalent in some place like Imperial Russia or early Soviet Russia, or in Germany during the 40s. So, where these people are sort of viewed as both parasites and something to be controlled. And so you can't relate to the fact that, they can manipulate geological forces, but you can relate to someone in a society which is very oppressive. You can relate to a woman who's fleeing an abusive relationship and who is also part of this caste.
Right.
And so, like you said, I've read other novels that are immersion novels where there are, where the main character is a spy. A spy and their role is accessible. The politics they're immersed in may not be accessible, but what the spy is and all the moral ambiguity of being a spy, we automatically have that. And so, as a result, those elements are very accessible. And so, I think that you can make the food entirely different. You can make the magic entirely, you know, a new magic system. You can make all that stuff different. But all of these writers that I'm thinking of who have written immersion stories, like Brandon Sanderson and Kay Jemison and, you know, all of these different folks, they write stories in which the roles are identifiable. The dilemmas are human dilemmas. They're identifiable.
Yes.
And I think that's true of almost any fantasy, but it's particularly important in immersion because so much is different.
Absolutely. So, okay, anything else you want to say about immersion fantasy?
Yeah, I could talk about it for ages, but that's the sort of foundational one.
Yeah. I hope you're enjoying this conversation about fantasy with Nico Taranovsky. Make sure you come back next week for part 2. We'll finish our conversation about Farah Mendelssohn's 4 types of fantasy, get into what writers need to know when they're planning to write a fantasy novel, and all kinds of other cool stuff. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.